So the headline today is greed. Now, being rich toward God means giving to the poor. If you want a simple explanation, being rich to God means taking care of those who have not enough. That gets us into that position. And today we're looking at greed. And I talk about the great shalom every week, right? Compassion, mercy, justice, forgiveness, and grace. Greed is a roadblock to grace or giving or generosity. And Jesus warns about all forms of greed today. For kind of a definition, let's just say that greed is, in Jesus' economy, an excess desire to accumulate wealth while others go without. Focused on the self while others go without. That's greed. Now, in today's story, we see a guy who asked Jesus to tell his brother to divide the family inheritance with him. And what we're talking about here is land. Land is everything. Now, for a minute, I'm going to borrow from the scholarship of Kenneth Bailey, who wrote the book Poet and Peasant Through Peasant Eyes. And he unpacks a variety of stories in Luke by interviewing people who live in peasant villages in Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. And in these villages, these people have a unique understanding and are ground to the cultures of the ancient Near East in which Jesus was preaching. And so Kenneth Bailey says by sharing these parables with these people, they will provide a unique insight to what the ancient ear might have heard. So the next few observations come from that. First off, the request of Jesus suggests that there is some contention between the brothers. There is some sort of fight or an argument that's going on. And of course, Jesus flat out denies the request. I'm not going to help you. Jesus understands that the request is a form of what is called naked justice, or the fight for more than either party even needs. And all of this falls, of course, into the rubric of greed that we're trying to unpack today. Now, Jesus would, in this case, seek to find reconciliation rather than division. The nature of this particular circumstance would be that Jesus would try to unite the brothers rather than divide them. And that's where then Jesus says, be aware, be on your guard against all forms of greed. Of course, we know that Jesus wants all people to have enough. And the world can sometimes be mean, cruel, and unfair, but to make sure that all people have enough. And certainly in Jesus' ministry, 90% of the people who lived in Palestine at that time were poor, were generally oppressed, and suffering from a degree of starvation. And so, in response to all this, Jesus tells a story about a rich man who has more than enough grain to feed his family, and he has this absolutely amazing harvest, right? He builds bigger barns to store the grain. So much so that he would never have to work again. And he'd be able to eat, drink, and be merry, eh? Now, in that story, what Jesus says is this: God's response is, you are a fool. You are a fool. So here's the fundamental problem when we try to follow Jesus. It's a problem or it's an opportunity, depending on how people look at this. But Jesus' primary concern and occupation is for the disadvantaged and the poor. That's the primary concern. And so if one is to be authentic in the ancient church and following Jesus, the first concern for a Christian should be the poor and the oppressed. This is just the way it is. And the final statement from Bailey is this: when it comes to radical forms of wealth, the question becomes, in the kingdom, what do I do with what I have not really earned? It's a big, bold question. And we don't have time to fully unpack it, but that's a question. Now, I'm leaving Bailey, and thank you, Kenneth Bailey, for those remarks. We'll hear from him occasionally as we look at some other parables. The problem with the society in which we live, the world in which we live, is that there is this basic feeling that one may accumulate all that they desire and live accordingly. Okay? Period. Now, okay, the problem is that is not the way of the Lord. The way of the Lord is something a little different. And to get to that point of being fully absorbed with the self, which moves us into some dimension of greed, there is the fear of not having enough that enters into that equation. I'm concerned, will I have enough for my family and friends and this type of thing? And that's where this whole greed thing starts. It starts. So here we are as Christians, followers of Jesus, trying to unpack this, doing the best we can. And how do we resolve whatever all this means in our own individual lives and in the life of the country? Now, if we look at economy from Jesus' perspective, Jesus would simply expect a redistribution of wealth on a voluntary basis. He would look for course corrections. And this, my friends, is certainly the case in the primitive church. We recognize that in the primitive church, we're looking at common ground, common distributions of wealth and this type of thing. And Paul, in his ministry, takes what Jesus teaches and tries to unpack these things in real time in the churches that he serves. And so Paul has a couple things to say about this. He recognizes that work is an outcome of work is wealth of some sort. And work should be that which generates wealth. Now, Paul says this in 2 Thessalonians. He says, a purpose of work is to work so that one is not a burden to another. You work, you get what you need, and you are simply operationally not a burden. But then Paul will go on to another dimension of work and wealth. And he says this in Ephesians, work so that one may give to those in need. So Paul and Jesus are saying you work to take care of yourself and you work to give to those in need. This is the Jesus economy, recognizing the world is an unfair, unequal footing, and there's all kinds of problems to unpack. Now, our culture doesn't quite line up with this thinking. It gets close at times. It might intersect a little from the standpoint there is a charitable sector and we can do a little bit of charity. And many of us operationally have given to others and this type of thing. But our overall culture does not lift this up. Generally speaking, just like the old days, the rich are praised and deeply protected, and the poor can sometimes be lost and forgotten. Now, with all of that said, what happens here is that we have not inherited, we have not, nor have our parents or their parents inherited a Jesus-based economy. It is foreign to us. It is hard to fully reconcile, and the church over hundreds and hundreds of years has sort of pushed this issue, this ancient issue that we read about in the Bible, off to the side and has re-engineered what faith means to be simply, not simply, but generally a worship-centered experience. We come to church, we worship, we give, we try to behave, and life goes on. Now, we know we do more than that, but there is a tendency to move in that direction. And when it has weakened the gospel message over time. Okay? It has taken the world of economics off of the table. Yet, if we dig into the gospel, we recognize this is the exact world that Jesus brokered in. He was dealing with economics. And sometimes, when it's addressed in the pulpit, there is a pushback, a resistance, based on a resistance to the practical dimensions of the piece. Sometimes, when we get into these economic kinds of things, people will simply say it's political, and that means I don't agree with what's being said. And it's hard for everybody. I don't care what side of the aisle you're on. It is hard to follow Jesus in this regard. It's not easy. We've not been brought up this way. And so the pushback, my friends, represents a departure from kingdom thinking in favor of competitive economics, where there are simply winners and losers and those that fall in between. This milieu is the milieu in which we were brought up. It's the milieu we were educated to work in, but it is not the milieu of the kingdom. And this is where we have an opportunity to stop, think, and see where it goes from here. Now, when looking, my friends, at the country in which we live, and we could pick dozens of other countries that would not be totally dissimilar, but in the country we live, and looking at our political, economic, and cultural experience, actions from a Christian perspective should be measured against the bigger question of common good. Are we as a society properly caring for all? Do we impose that Christian will into the milieu, saying all people need to be lifted up? Now, if the only way I can look at that is that whether or not we're doing that is we look at distribution of wealth. That's the roadmap. And what we have in our country is 10% of the people, the top 10%, control 65% of the wealth. The bottom 50% control less than 5% of the wealth. And the middle 40% controls about 30% of the wealth. Now, when I paint that economic picture and I frame it up against the economics of Jesus, it is fair to say this is not a Christian nation. I mean, we worship Jesus, we wave the flag, but if I look at distribution, it's not operationalizing itself. And since it is not operationalizing itself, it's best that we just don't call us a Christian nation. That's a disservice to Jesus. It's not that we're bad and horrible, but let's get real. What Jesus was teaching, we have lots of work to do. That's all. We have lots of work to do. So in the end, my friends, we have to be on guard. We have to be watchful for all kinds of greed. And it really does. It begins with ourselves. And when we look at the Great Shalom and we look at grace and generosity, how do we discern where we are in this milieu of greed? And how do we move from whatever dimension of that we may be residing in into more of a giving relationship with the world? All of this starts with overcoming the fear that there's never enough. It starts there. And it's promoted. You can never, ever have enough. And it creates a fear. But the good news is if we can overcome that fear, we move into a dimension of gratitude. And through gratitude, what is stimulated is contentment. The peace. I can feel it. It's real. And then, as we go into higher and higher ground, we are able to more clearly distinguish the difference between needs and wants. We can start to see what that looks like, and we can begin to make whatever adjustments we think are important. But once we get there, that's when we are given the vision of the unmet needs of others. I've climbed that mountain. I can see better now. I get it. It's real. It's true. And when we get there, my friends, we achieve a feeling called empathy and peace. And what it does is it generates even greater degrees of generosity for each of us in our own way. And once we do that, because once you get into this shalom deeper and deeper, what happens? It's not drudgery. What happens is you feel great joy. Contentment, joy. God always says, I love a joyful giver. And he recognized a joyful giver is someone who has worked through all of this and is at that point. The whole experience, my friends, moves us more into a communal way of thinking. And it takes us back. It takes us back, my friends, to the primitive church. The church that understood Jesus better than we can ever understand. The church that was literally trying to live this thing out. And it puts us into a proper position, my friends, of fighting for justice for all. Oh, my goodness gracious. And I'll tell you what. When we get there, we have entered the kingdom here on earth. Yes. And what a great kingdom it is. Can I get an amen? Amen. Amen.